each reader to a great novel infuses that text with something of their own. And I think the same is true in many ways for much, not all, but much of philosophy, and certainly the philosophy of a man like Nietzsche.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Wilco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Wilco Foods CEO, Stephen Toberoff.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Wilco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toberoff, and today I'm going to discuss something that is almost exclusively philosophical in nature. But the reason that this podcast has guests from a variety of industries and subject matter covered from a variety of perspectives, and why in the introduction of this podcast we mention hospitality, business, culture, and the mind is because from my perspective, to be an effective business leader and an effective human being and a flourishing human being, I don't think it's constructive to create artificial lines and delineations within one's activities, meaning this is my business mind, and then when I'm doing my hobby, I'll switch to my hobby mind, and then when I'm engaged in family, it'll be my family mind, and then when I'm reading or educating, it's that mind. I like to view it all as one continuum and one sort of self-reinforcing circle. So for those who are not necessarily initially interested in philosophy, I think this podcast will still be of interest because I know for myself that I often rely upon the insights that I've gleaned from reading a variety of subjects to help me make much better business decisions. So in any event, approximately 5 or 6 months ago, I did a podcast on Nietzsche, and I received a number of emails on it. It was a very well listened to episode. It was very critical of Nietzsche. At that time, I had read pretty much all of his writings that I've yet read, with the exception of, at that point, I had not read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But in my critique of Nietzsche, and it was a critique, I said many things about him that I think were very critical and very incorrect based upon my perspective on Nietzsche now. And I felt that it was so incorrect, that initial podcast, that I decided to take it down because it's not something that I want to have out there as people believing that that's my perspective on Nietzsche. Or more importantly, I don't want to mislead anybody who's never read Nietzsche. They might listen to me and say, oh, I'm not going to deal with this guy. So I took it down, but I've given the subject thought since then, and I've done a lot of different reading on a lot of different subjects since then. And a book that I just read recently led me to reevaluate Nietzsche and inspired me to do this podcast now. And the book that I read that inspired me to rethink things was a book called The Wisdom of Life by Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was a philosophy professor and a philosopher. He was a contemporary of Hegel. He was very well admired, beloved, influential to Wagner, who of course was a very close friend for a long time of Nietzsche's, and was very much admired by Nietzsche as well for a long period of time until Nietzsche had a different perspective. And The Wisdom of Life is an excellent text, and I highly recommend it. It's extremely well written, extremely thought-provoking, and it's actually quite positive and life-affirming. And much of what Schopenhauer writes about there are sort of themes and subject matters that I can relate to. He talks about the importance of cultivating a rich inner world and how, in fact, that's the most important thing we can do to lead a flourishing and enjoyable life. He talks about the pitfalls of pride and seeking validation from those outside of ourselves. And it's just a very, very well-written, relatively short text. I highly recommend it. And so I enjoyed it. And I even remember saying to some people, I think I've found my soulmate here as a philosopher. But then I went on to read some of his other thoughts and maxims and a little bit more about what his core philosophical beliefs were, because Schopenhauer was known as a pessimist. And pessimism, as Schopenhauer describes it, is that life is essentially about suffering, and the best you can do is avoid suffering, and it's almost better to have never been born. And I completely disagree with that approach. But the reason I'm mentioning this lead-in with Schopenhauer and how it affected Nietzsche, which will be the substance of this podcast, is that I never understood within myself, I was always struggling how it is that someone such as myself that places such an absolute foundational premium on my personal relationship with God, why I had such an affinity for Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a terrific writer, energetic writer, brilliant writer, but he's also a strident atheist, which we'll get into in a little bit in my podcast, which again is completely different than my perspective on the world. And yet I was consistently drawn to Nietzsche, empathetic towards him, conflicted. Whereas with Schopenhauer, once I began to read about his pessimism, it was very easy for me to make a clean break. I have no antipathy towards Schopenhauer. I still have a collection of his essays, his later works, where he writes on subjects other than pessimism, but I abandoned happily his main work, The World as Will and Representation. But I had no affinity for Schopenhauer. I was a little disappointed that for him, actually, that he had this perspective on life. But it was very easy for me to make a clean break. But it started me thinking more and more about Nietzsche. And the more I thought about it, I came to a perspective on Nietzsche that might be controversial to people, but to me, it makes all the sense in the world. And that's going to be the substance of the podcast, which is, unlike Schopenhauer, I do not believe that Nietzsche was an atheist. I believe that Nietzsche is somebody who had a deep, all-consuming, visceral, elemental desire to connect with the divine, to connect with God. And unfortunately, the circumstances in life wherein he found himself, 19th century German Christianity being rules-based, divorced of the passion and connection with God, psychological trauma from the death of his father. When Nietzsche was 5, his father was a pastor, interestingly enough. So that my reading of Nietzsche, when I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when I read The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, Twilight of the Idols, Genealogy of Morals, less so Genealogy of Morals, but when I read Nietzsche's main works, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Gay Science, I read these works of his, it's very clear to me that Nietzsche is somebody that is actively seeking out a connection with the divine, with the transcendent. But because he's unable to understand how to do that, because of the world he finds himself, he turns this dynamic inward, creates this, I was going to say nonsense, and in my view it is nonsense, but to be respectful, this notion of the Ubermensch, the Superman. And he writes a lot of things that, to me, have to be looked at inversely to get the true meaning of them. And that's what I want to discuss here a little bit, because I do really like Nietzsche. And I think Nietzsche was a very troubled individual, a brilliant individual. He would probably despise me, on one sense, for doing this podcast. On another sense, if I could expose him to other ways of looking at God and life, perhaps he would thank me. So the first thing we have to talk about with respect to Nietzsche to sort of support my thesis is Nietzsche's famous quote from the book, The Gay Science, sometimes translated to mean The Joyous Science, where he writes, "God is dead, and we have killed him." And there's a lengthy continuation of these thoughts in the text of The Gay Science. And he mentions the same concept again in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Zarathustra runs into the wise man on the mountain, and Zarathustra says he doesn't know that God is dead. So what does Nietzsche mean with this very shocking comment? Because the first time that I read it, I was very offended, quite frankly, because I'm very protective of God. I'm protective of my personal relationship. And so a thought of that nature to me was immediately triggered my sense of displeasure and defensiveness. And as so often happens when we allow our emotions to get activated, it muddled my thinking. But upon reflection, when you think about it, the very statement itself reaffirms the existence of God. How so? Well, one, when he says God is dead and we have killed him, clearly any conception of God means that it's transcendent of mortality and transcendent of humans, transcendent of the life that God creates. So the very notion that one God could die and the entire world is still existing, in a literal sense, is absurd. And that humans could kill God is, of course, absurd because God is transcendent, God is immortal, God is not a man. So Nietzsche can't be saying this in a literal sense because it would make no sense. Now, the people who affirm or read Nietzsche at a very superficial level might say, well, what they're saying is that this notion of God was created by humans. It's a fallacy. And humans killed him. They created him, the concept, and they killed him. I think that's an extraordinarily superficial and unsatisfactory explanation of what really Nietzsche is saying here. What Nietzsche is saying here, as I interpret him, is that our inability, and again, this has to be very much contextualized within Nietzsche's experience of life. 19th century Germany, Christian practice in 19th century Germany. Very formulaic, very rules-based, very recognizing the passion and the joy and the exuberance of being alive and the opportunities to connect with God, which are celebrated in Hasidic philosophy, are celebrated in evangelicalism, are celebrated in many religious traditions. They're not in the world that Nietzsche lived in. So what I hear him saying there, what I interpret him to mean there, is that the humans, in their inability to craft and interact with God in the way we are supposed to, we've essentially killed him for ourselves. God isn't dead. We're dead. And the reason we're dead is because we are not taking advantage of the opportunity to connect. So this is the foundational sort of sine qua non of understanding my interpretation of Nietzsche, which is psychological in nature. It's a very idiosyncratic approach to Nietzsche that I have, but it's instructed by my readings of him. It's instructed by the Sue Prideaux biography. It's instructed by other academic writings on Nietzsche. So that's how we have to address what might appear as atheism is the first cry of Nietzsche in anger, not at God, but at the material world that has so failed in providing him with the venue he desperately wants and needs to connect with the divine. Anyone who's read Nietzsche, anyone who's been totally inspired by the passion and the energy and the enthusiasm that he writes about life, that he writes about the excitement, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. I was going to read some passages, but I almost felt inappropriate doing that because I don't want my selected preferences of Nietzsche to somehow obscure other people who might find ones themselves. Suffice it to say, if you've read Nietzsche, you know what I'm referring to. The man was absolutely poetic in some of his writings about the incredible energy and opportunity and vitality that we can create through existence. Those are concepts that are not in disharmony with a God. They're the very emotions, dynamics, phenomenon that we would want to tap into to maximize that relationship. So that's my foundational interpretation, starting with that quote. Then there's another passage where in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, I believe in a God who dances. Now, some people have viewed that as a deliberately snide and negative and disrespectful comment, again, I view it otherwise. Viewed within my psychological analysis of Nietzsche, Nietzsche intuitively understands that to connect with God is to dance, is to celebrate, is to be joyous. And yet he doesn't see the pathway to do that. And so he has to contextualize this concept within Thus Spoke Zarathustra in a manner that is very opaque. And so in thinking about it, we reach a conclusion, at least with this passage and other things, that far from being somebody who was truly an atheist, and I know many Nietzsche scholars will say I'm completely wrong here, and they're entitled to say it. But the approach that I'm taking to Nietzsche is the same, and not even Nietzsche, although I am making a psychological argument about him, but when it comes to the texts, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, I'm taking the approach of a literary critic. You know, I've always believed, and many professors I had in college and scholars I've read since then, to be an effective literary critic, you have to allow the text to exist on its own. Meaning the purpose of reading great literature, great philosophy, is not to play a game of try to puzzle what was in the mind of the author. So that if I read The Brothers Karamazov or Jane Eyre, the value I can derive from reading Jane Eyre is not to try to piece together what Charlotte Bronte meant by every scene and every character. That's a banal and unsatisfying game. Each reader to a great novel infuses that text with something of their own. And I think the same is true in many ways for much, not all, but much of philosophy, and certainly the philosophy of a man like Nietzsche, who relied, except for in the Genealogy of Morals and The Birth of Tragedy, his major works were all essentially aphorisms. So he's writing in an almost quasi-poetic format. Much of the way that he writes is left open to interpretation. Very famous passage from Beyond Good and Evil. When a man stares deep into the abyss stares into him. In my world, it's much more interesting and enjoyable and gratifying to try to ascertain what that means for me, that profound line, versus trying to prove what Nietzsche meant. This makes sense to people, right? So that's the approach that I'm taking to the writing of Nietzsche. That's the approach that I take to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So when I read that, I say it's only, of course, appropriate and natural that he would be yearning for a God who dances, because he's in a world where the representation of God and the portrayal of God is totally couched within antiseptic formalism that doesn't allow for that joy and that excitement to flourish. So this is another aspect of Nietzsche that comes through in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Another element of Nietzsche that I have to discuss, which I also think ties into this, because many people are not aware of this, and I think it's to his great credit, is that Nietzsche lived in a world, both contextually and intimately, where anti-Semitism was very prevalent, and his sister Elizabeth was a rabid anti-Semite, as was her husband. And Nietzsche, because of his sister, and because of her great affection for Hitler and the Third Reich, allowed Nietzsche's writings and legacy to be distorted in a way that a very superficial and, I would argue, highly inappropriate reading serves as a justification for the underlying theories, the Aryan mastery race theories and others that underlie the thinking, the culture, the foundations of the Nazis. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. Nietzsche had a contempt for anti-Semitism and found it unintellectual. Not suggesting that he didn't write critically of religions and critically of Jews at a certain point, but it's an important thing to understand about Nietzsche within this context, that Nietzsche was not an unsophisticated individual, and that Nietzsche was very much in tune as to how his writing could be misunderstood. So he's asking us to look deeper. And as a sort of a personal point, and now we can sort of transition into something that may have more direct relevance to be successful in business. One of the great things about philosophy and literature and reading it deeply and reading the greats is you find that what you read requires a level of analysis and perspective that's not that dissimilar to reading to observing modern art, where what appears to be the case at first blush is not the case at all. It's reminiscent of what Melville writes in Moby Dick, all visible objects are but pasteboard masks. We have to see through the facade, and we have to have the intuition to want to see through the facade. So it's very clear, like I would never do this podcast on Schopenhauer. I think Schopenhauer really was a pessimist. That was a philosophical paradigm that he created. And in reading him, I don't have the empathy or the interest to go deeper into what he was actually looking to do. Nietzsche is not like that. Nietzsche is complicated and rich and vibrant and invites the reader to, I think, assist him both in his efficacy for the reader as well as assist him in his legacy. And this is not dissimilar to what we have to do in life and in business. We have to have the capacity to see through things that at first blush appear one way. For me, this is often the case when I'm dealing with people in a conversation. One of the most valuable lessons that I've learned is, it used to be the case with me that when I would have a conversation with somebody, and they would say things that to me appeared to be incredibly inconsistent with the level of knowledge or experience they should have based on their profession, based on their years of doing something. And they would say things that in my perspective were inconsistent with that. It would evoke feelings of anger and frustration. But what I've learned is that the people who are saying these things that in my perspective have an inaccurately or an inappropriately low understanding of what they're trying to say, they're doing the best they can 9 times out of 10. They're not deliberately trying to be provocative. Or sometimes when you have an employee that'll come to you or to a manager, and that's in an extremely agitated state about something, when you give them the opportunity to express themselves and reflect, and you don't match that anger or that frustration, that energy with the same type of energy, you can then realize that that first blast of heat is really a facade for something to cover up something else. This is not uncommon. And I think with Nietzsche, and this is why I think he is such an important philosopher, and why you shouldn't. If I felt that Nietzsche was somebody who really believed what he was writing at a very basic level, and if his writings weren't so rich with subconscious and other metaphors and stories and dynamics that invite one to look deeper, I would essentially take the same approach that I've taken with Schopenhauer, which is put it out of my mind. Whatever they write that's of value, great. Whatever isn't, forget about it. But that's not the case with Nietzsche. I mean, I still stand by what I said in the first podcast, and this was a quote from an academic from Toronto, that Nietzsche is at best a character in Dostoevsky's world. That's true. Dostoevsky is able to take us through the depths of everything, but also leave us out on the other side with a very rich, deep, and in most cases positive way of formulating the phenomenon that we've just been through. This is why I think that Nietzsche was such a great admirer of Dostoevsky's. Nietzsche said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist he ever needed or learned anything from. So, in summation, I did this podcast because I needed to clear the air and to really share what my sort of correct and deeper understanding of Nietzsche is. And I think he can be read by people like myself and others who love philosophy and love great literature, but also love God and lead a very spiritual life. I think Nietzsche's writings are very spiritual. I think Nietzsche is a man that unfortunately endured a great deal of suffering in his life. I think he was brilliant. But I think that due to the degenerative brain disease that ultimately landed him in a mental institution for the remaining several years of his life as a result of syphilis, I think due to deep-rooted psychological issues, and I think due to the unfortunate fact that he never had an opportunity to engage with a religious construct that would have actually been a direct contradiction to the perspective of religion that he had, he found himself in this position. Now, I am leaving to the side deliberately one key concept of Nietzsche's, which he explores in the genealogy of morals, which is his notion of slave morality versus master morality. I think that's a concept that is a very deep and rich and complicated concept that is really, that can be viewed completely separate from what I'm discussing here. And I don't really want to bring it up because I think it's not relevant to what I'm talking about. Very briefly and simplistically, the slave morality, Nietzsche believes that the way that Christianity permeated through Western Europe created a dynamic where weak and meek and the celebration of victimhood somehow played a trick and put themselves in a position where they were at the top of the hierarchy of power in society. And that the people who are naturally energetic and courageous and desirous of conquest were forced to subjugate themselves to this new ascendant morality, which Nietzsche describes as a slave morality, and that this is a distortion of how the world should work. It's a deep concept. It's a complicated concept. It's one that would require its own podcast that I don't, quite frankly, have enough interest in doing right now. But I think whatever one thinks of that particular aspect of Nietzsche's thinking, it does not impact what I'm trying to say here, which is that I believe that Nietzsche was somebody who was, whether he knew it or not, deeply spiritual. And I think that his works can be read, particularly Thus Spoke Zarathustra and The Gay Science, can be best read as a man crying out for God, but not knowing how to connect. And that one can take, in the same way we take a Marxist approach to literature, and in the same way we can take a Freudian approach to literature, I suggest that by taking the approach that I just shared and overlaying that on Nietzsche's writings, it produces a very rich, powerful, moving, meaningful, enervating, philosophical text and something to think about. So in any event, I appreciate the people who have sent me emails on my prior podcast on Nietzsche, and I always welcome input from people who have listened to the show. I love it. You can email me at steven@wilcofoods.com. You can DM me on Instagram at steven@wilcofoods. And, I understand that this is a controversial perspective. I understand it's a perspective that many people might feel is being disrespectful to Nietzsche. I've already shared with you why I don't think that's the case, but would love to hear from the people who do disagree with me, would love to get a deeper perspective on your view of things. And maybe, depending on who emails me, maybe it would be wonderful to bring on somebody as a guest that's got a background in Nietzsche and have that discussion with somebody else who has a different perspective. I think it would be richer for me and richer for the audience. If you've enjoyed this content, I always appreciate it if you can share it with other people. Please like it, please comment. It certainly helps us with the algorithms. I have a number of exciting interviews and subjects coming up. Was a little bit late in getting this podcast out. There were a number of things that we've been doing here at Wilco, which we're very excited about. And I look forward to my next podcast, which is going to be about the World Cup and the immediate impacts on the hospitality industry that we can expect. God willing, I will be having that podcast out well in advance of the first World Cup game. So with that being said, I appreciate everyone for listening. I look forward to your comments. I look forward to your input. Really value this audience. And the opportunity to share my thoughts with you and to hear your perspective in response to what I say. So with that, everybody, have an awesome, awesome day.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Stephen Toberoff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.